Spring 1943. On the steaming beaches of Guadalcanal, the first groups of Japanese prisoners shuffled into American custody. Exhausted, many were half-starved, their uniforms torn, their rifles worn smooth by tropical rain. To them, surrender had been unthinkable. Capture was shame. Yet what shocked them most was not the dishonor, but what they saw on the other side of the barbed wire. The Americans were not what Japanese soldiers had been taught to expect. Propaganda in Tokyo had painted U.S. troops as soft, undisciplined men who relied on machines because they lacked spirit. The first days of captivity shattered that illusion. Japanese prisoners noticed immediately every American soldier carried far more equipment than they did. Helmets, fresh uniforms, entrenching tools, spare boots, even socks in abundance. In Japanese diaries captured later, one line appeared again and again: they had so much. Food became the clearest marker of difference. At Guadalcanal, American field kitchens served hot meals with canned meat, vegetables, even fruit juice. Soldiers received candy bars and chewing gum as part of their rations. By contrast, the Japanese had survived on a few handfuls of rice, often moldy or full of weevils. Some had eaten grass and roots when supply barges failed to arrive. A corporal from the Japanese 38th Division, interviewed by Allied translators, summed up the disbelief. "We were told the Americans would run out of supplies after a few weeks, but they had more every day. How can one army have endless food?" The answer lay thousands of miles away. In Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, U.S. factories had shifted into full wartime gear. The arsenal of democracy was running at a scale the world had never seen. Liberty ships launched almost daily from the yards at Richmond and Portland. Boxcars of Spam and powdered milk rolled west toward Pacific ports. Industrial agriculture in the Midwest ensured American soldiers were not just fed, they were overfed by global wartime standards. Prisoners noticed other details that reinforced the sense of disparity. When American trucks broke down, mechanics replaced entire engines within hours. Japanese units, by contrast, often abandoned vehicles for lack of spare parts. Bulldozers cleared land for airstrips in days, while Japanese engineers, working with hand tools, needed weeks to carve out a rough runway. The captured Japanese were not naive. Many were seasoned veterans of campaigns in China or Malaya. They had seen hardship before, but they had never encountered an enemy who seemed able to replace every bullet fired, every tank lost, every ship sunk, almost overnight. By the middle of 1943, Allied intelligence officers were compiling reports from interrogated POWs. Again and again, the same theme appeared: astonishment at America's capacity. One sergeant captured at Buna told his interrogators, "We thought the United States could not fight far from home. Then we saw how your ships keep coming, always full. Japan cannot do this." What prisoners saw with their own eyes was only a glimpse of the machine behind it all. In that year alone, U.S. shipyards launched more than 20 million tons of merchant shipping, more than Japan would produce in the entire war. American aircraft plants built over 80,000 planes, while Japan managed fewer than 25,000. For the men who had grown up believing in the invincibility of the Imperial Army, the contrast was almost unbearable. Some rationalized it by claiming Americans feared combat and relied on supplies to fight. Others, more candid in post-war interviews, admitted that morale began to crack when they realized they were not just fighting American soldiers, they were fighting the American economy. The first encounters in the jungles of Guadalcanal and New Guinea left an impression deeper than any battlefield defeat. The Japanese soldiers had entered the war convinced that willpower and sacrifice could overcome material shortages. Captivity revealed the truth. Spirit could not fill an empty stomach, and courage could not summon ammunition that did not exist. What began as shock and prison camps would, as the war dragged on, become a central theme of Japanese testimony. America's production capacity was not just large, it was unimaginable. By late 1943,
The war in the Pacific had shifted from jungle outposts to the skies. For Japanese soldiers and sailors, the clearest sign of America's power no longer came from rations or bulldozers. It came from the endless streams of aircraft overhead. At first, Japanese pilots mocked American machines. The B-17 Flying Fortress was dismissed as slow, ungainly, and vulnerable. The twin-boomed P-38 Lightning earned nicknames like two planes with one pilot and was seen as too complicated to survive. But as months passed, those jokes disappeared. Testimonies from Japanese aviators collected after the war show a growing sense of awe and dread at the scale of U.S. air power. In November 1943, during raids on Rabaul, Japanese anti-aircraft gunners reported skies blotted out by American bombers. Over 350 aircraft struck the base in waves, with fresh squadrons appearing just as the first formations withdrew. A Japanese officer later told interrogators, "We could not believe how many came. We thought it must be all of America's planes." But the next day, more came again. That disbelief was grounded in a harsh truth. U.S. factories were producing aircraft at a pace no Axis nation could match. In 1943 alone, America built nearly 86,000 planes. Japan managed barely a quarter of that number. For every zero that rolled out of a Mitsubishi plant, 4 or 5 Hellcats or Thunderbolts left American assembly lines. On the front lines, the effect was devastating. Fighter units that lost 10 planes in a week were replenished in days. Pilots who parachuted into the sea could expect another machine waiting for them within hours. Japanese flyers, by contrast, often flew the same aging airframe until it broke apart in combat.
Ground troops noticed the difference as well. On islands like Tarawa and Kwajalein, soldiers crouched in foxholes as American bombers pounded defenses for hours at a time. Survivors wrote in diaries that the reign of iron seemed endless. Many believed no nation could possess such reserves of aircraft and munitions. Captured war diaries from the Japanese 4th Air Group described the toll of these raids. One pilot wrote in February 1944, "We shoot one down and 10 more arrive. It is like fighting against the ocean." The American strategy was simple but overwhelming. Saturate the skies, deny Japan air superiority, and grind down its already limited pilot corps. By 1943, Japanese aviators were among the most experienced in the world. But experience could not replace machines. As U.S. fighters grew more advanced, first the P-38, then the F-6F Hellcat and P-51 Mustang, the balance tipped irreversibly. What astonished many Japanese was not just the quality of U.S. aircraft, but the fact that they arrived in swarms, well-armed, well-fueled, and supported by a constant stream of spare parts. This was more than technology. It was industry turned into strategy. At the strategic level, the industrial disparity became unmistakable when the first B-29 Superfortresses appeared in 1944. With wings stretching longer than a Zero's entire fuselage, the B-29 carried bombs from altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach. To defenders on the ground, their silver formations seemed endless. A Japanese schoolteacher in Nagoya later recalled, "The sky was full of silver birds. We wondered if America had emptied its country of machines." The truth was starker. America had not emptied its factories. It had barely tapped them. For Japanese soldiers and civilians alike, the realization was crushing. No matter how bravely they fought, every Zero lost, every anti-aircraft gun destroyed, every bomber shot down, each would be replaced many times over. The war in the air was not just a clash of pilots. It was a contest of factories, and Japan was outnumbered before each battle began. If the skies belonged to America, so too did the seas. Japanese soldiers and sailors had grown up in a nation that revered its navy as the shield of the empire. The victories of 1905 against Russia and the early triumphs of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines seemed to confirm Japan's mastery of the ocean. But by 1943, the illusion was breaking apart, not only because of battles lost, but because of a force more relentless than any admiral: American shipyards. In Tokyo, planners had imagined that Japan's submarine fleet could strangle America's supply lines. But the strategy collapsed when the United States began launching merchant ships faster than the Japanese Navy could sink them.
At the Kaiser Yards in Richmond, California, Liberty ships slid into the water at record speed. One famously went from keel laying to launch in less than 5 days. By war's end, nearly 2,700 would be built, more tonnage than the entire Japanese merchant fleet in 1941.
Captured Japanese documents revealed the shock this caused. An officer in the combined fleet admitted after the war, "We believed each ship sunk would weaken America, but each week more appeared. It was as if your nation had endless seas of steel." And it was not just cargo ships. American shipyards produced carriers, destroyers, and submarines on a scale that dwarfed Japanese efforts. The Essex-class carriers, designed before the war, entered service one after another in 1943 and 1944, each capable of carrying more aircraft than some entire Japanese divisions. Japan, by contrast, could not replace the 4 fleet carriers lost at Midway. New ships, like Shinano, were built too slowly and arrived too late. For Japanese sailors, the contrast became painfully clear in the Solomons. Each time an American destroyer went down, another soon appeared. Each time a cruiser was damaged, it returned to battle repaired and rearmed. By 1943, the Imperial Navy faced a grinding truth. It was fighting not just fleets, but factories. Ground troops also saw the evidence. On island after island, American convoys unloaded mountains of supplies, tanks, trucks, cranes, and even prefabricated buildings. Japanese defenders, short on ammunition and rations, watched as their enemies built entire bases from steel that seemed conjured out of nothing. Prisoners taken at Tarawa described the psychological blow of seeing fresh landing craft swarm the beaches while new carriers waited offshore. "We thought if we destroyed one wave, the attack would end," one sergeant told interrogators. "But when we fired all our bullets, the Americans still came. More ships waited. More men came ashore." Behind the front, Japanese intelligence officers tried to calculate America's output. Reports filed in 1943 suggested the United States could produce perhaps 10 carriers a year. The reality was nearly double. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy had more carriers in service than Japan had ever possessed in its entire history. It was not merely numbers. The speed of repair stunned Japanese observers. After the Battle of Santa Cruz, damaged carriers like Enterprise limped back to Pearl Harbor. Within weeks, they returned to action. Japanese sailors expected months, even years, for such repairs. America's industrial base made the impossible routine. The lesson reached into every prison camp. Soldiers captured in the Solomons whispered to each other that Japan could not possibly match such production. Some still clung to the belief that spirit and sacrifice could balance the scales. But others, more pragmatic, admitted what they saw with their own eyes. America's steel was inexhaustible. By 1944, the Imperial Navy was no longer just losing battles, it was losing faith. The sea that had once promised protection now carried an endless tide of American ships. For Japanese soldiers, the war had become a nightmare. No matter how many convoys were attacked, no matter how many vessels were sunk, the horizon always filled again, with steel from Detroit, steel from Richmond, steel from everywhere. For the Japanese soldier on the ground, the war was often a matter of hunger and endurance. By 1942 and 1943, many were already fighting on empty stomachs. Rice shipments from the home islands were disrupted by submarines, ammunition was rationed, and replacements seldom arrived. Yet whenever they faced the Americans, the contrast was like night and day. At Guadalcanal, Japanese troops learned quickly that the enemy was supplied on a scale that seemed impossible. When U.S. Marines seized Henderson Field, reinforcements flowed in not just with rifles, but with bulldozers, fuel trucks, and cranes. Japanese accounts described disbelief as Americans leveled jungle, paved runways, and erected fuel tanks in weeks. A Japanese lieutenant captured in 1943 admitted, "We fought for every coconut, every grain of rice.
The Americans brought entire mountains of food. Food was the most visible difference. American rations included canned meat, vegetables, chocolate, and cigarettes. Japanese soldiers lived on dwindling sacks of rice, often reduced to half rations or less. Diaries taken from dead officers spoke of men boiling tree roots or eating insects to survive. Watching their enemies eat candy bars in the middle of combat was a bitter lesson in what industry meant on the battlefield. Tarawa in 1943 made the disparity unmistakable. The Japanese garrison defended bravely, but after the initial landing waves, they saw something that shook their morale. The Americans did not run out. When landing craft were destroyed, others took their place. When ammunition was spent, fresh crates poured onto the beaches. Survivors later told interrogators that they believed the enemy must have been storing supplies for months. The truth was harsher. American convoys brought new cargo almost daily. Even after brutal battles, Americans seemed to regenerate instantly. Bulldozers pushed wreckage aside, engineers repaired runways under fire, and supply ships anchored offshore continued unloading without pause. One Japanese diary recovered from Tarawa read, "They fall and more rise. Their ships bring endless things. For us, no ship comes." Seabees, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, were perhaps the most shocking sight of all. To Japanese defenders accustomed to using shovels and hand tools, these men operated heavy machinery like weapons of war. In a matter of days, they transformed coral atolls into air bases, carving runways where Japanese engineers would have needed months. A Japanese officer wrote after capture, "It is as if they carry entire cities with them." The psychological toll deepened as battle stretched across the Pacific. In New Guinea, Japanese units often carried only what they could march with through jungles and swamps. Ammunition had to be rationed. Heavy artillery was almost impossible to move. Americans, by contrast, brought trucks, tractors, and pipelines. They built roads where none had existed, ensuring supply columns never ceased. Prisoners began to admit openly what their commanders had denied. One sergeant, captured at Buna, confessed, "We thought you were weak, dependent on machines. But your machines mean you never starve, never run out of bullets. We starve. We die with empty hands." For the Japanese soldier on the ground, the war was often a matter of hunger and endurance. By 1942 and 1943, many were already fighting on empty stomachs. Rice shipments from the home islands were disrupted by submarines. Ammunition was rationed and replacements seldom arrived. Yet whenever they faced the Americans, the contrast was like night and day. At Guadalcanal, Japanese troops learned quickly that the enemy was supplied on a scale that seemed impossible. When U.S. Marines seized Henderson Field, reinforcements flowed in not just with rifles, but with bulldozers, fuel trucks, and cranes. Japanese accounts described disbelief as Americans leveled jungle, paved runways, and erected fuel tanks in weeks. A Japanese lieutenant captured in 1943 admitted, "We fought for every coconut, every grain of rice. The Americans brought entire mountains of food." Food was the most visible difference. American rations included canned meat, vegetables, chocolate, and cigarettes. Japanese soldiers lived on dwindling sacks of rice, often reduced to half rations or less. Diaries taken from dead officers spoke of men boiling tree roots or eating insects to survive. Watching their enemies eat candy bars in the middle of combat was a bitter lesson in what industry meant on the battlefield. Tarawa in 1943 made the disparity unmistakable. The Japanese garrison defended bravely, but after the initial landing waves, they saw something that shook their morale. The Americans did not run out. When landing craft were destroyed, others took their place. When ammunition was spent, fresh crates poured onto the beaches. Survivors later told interrogators that they believed the enemy must have been storing supplies for months. The truth was harsher. American convoys brought new cargo almost daily. Even after brutal battles, Americans seemed to regenerate instantly. Bulldozers pushed wreckage aside, Engineers repaired runways under fire, and supply ships anchored offshore continued unloading without pause. One Japanese diary, recovered from Tarawa, read, "They fall and more rise. Their ships bring endless things. For us, no ship comes." Seabees, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, were perhaps the most shocking sight of all. To Japanese defenders, accustomed to using shovels and hand tools, these men operated heavy machinery like weapons of war. In a matter of days, they transformed coral atolls into air bases, carving runways where Japanese engineers would have needed months. A Japanese officer wrote after capture, "It is as if they carry entire cities with them." The psychological toll deepened as battles stretched across the Pacific. In New Guinea, Japanese units often carried only what they could march with through jungles and swamps. Ammunition had to be rationed. Heavy artillery was almost impossible to move. Americans, by contrast, brought trucks, tractors, and pipelines. They built roads where none had existed, ensuring supply columns never ceased. Prisoners began to admit openly what their commanders had denied. One sergeant captured at Buna confessed, "We thought you were weak, dependent on machines. But your machines mean you never starve, never run out of bullets. We starve. We die with empty hands."
The building of advanced bases deepened the lesson. At Espiritu Santo and later at Guam, Americans constructed massive oil storage facilities, millions of gallons protected in underground tanks. Seabees bulldozed hillsides, installed pipelines, and laid out airfields capable of launching hundreds of planes daily. For Japanese units dependent on hand-carried barrels, the scale was unimaginable. Aircraft production itself underscored the imbalance. U.S. factories built nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, from fighters to heavy bombers. Japanese soldiers at the front noticed the difference. Captured records describe disbelief when American fighters destroyed Japanese aircraft in battle one day, only for the skies to be filled with fresh squadrons the next. One Japanese pilot, interrogated after the war, admitted, "For every zero we lost, replacing it took months. For every lightning they lost, another came next week." Oil and airfields connected every campaign. When Americans landed on Saipan in 1944, they immediately built runways for B-29 bombers. Japanese civilians and troops alike watched as long concrete strips appeared where sugarcane fields had been. Within weeks, bombers were flying directly to Tokyo. The speed with which Americans projected strategic air power across the Pacific left Japanese planners stunned. By late 1944, many Japanese soldiers understood the war was unwinnable, not because of courage or tactics, but because of energy. Without oil, planes could not fly, ships could not sail, trucks could not move. With oil, the United States created a global reach Japan could not challenge. The industrial might that supplied endless barrels and built endless runways had become the decisive weapon. For Japanese prisoners interviewed in 1945, the memory of stacked oil drums and roaring American airfields remained vivid. They had fought bravely, but they had seen the truth. Victory belonged not to those who starved, but to those who could fuel the sky. If Japanese soldiers on Pacific Islands were astonished by the scale of American airfields, their sense of shock deepened when they realized how those resources arrived. The Pacific Ocean became an American highway. Convoys of Liberty ships, tankers, troop transports, and carriers stretched from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor, from Pearl to the Solomons and beyond. For men raised in an island empire that struggled to produce even a few dozen merchant ships a year, the scale of U.S. maritime logistics was incomprehensible. Captured diaries from Guadalcanal spoke of endless American reinforcements. A Japanese sergeant wrote in December 1942, "Every week new ships appear like ants crossing the sea. We sink one,
3 more arrive. That observation was not exaggeration. At the height of the war, American shipyards produced 1 Liberty ship every 42 days on average. Some yards achieved records of 1 completed every 4 days. Japanese soldiers learned this through bitter experience. No matter how many freighters, submarines, or aircraft managed to destroy, American replacements filled the void almost instantly.
Japanese supply lines, by contrast, shrank under relentless U.S. submarine attacks. The so-called Tokyo Express, destroyers running night supply missions to Guadalcanal, delivered only a fraction of what garrisons required. Japanese soldiers fought on starvation rations, while across the beach, Americans unloaded mountains of crates, fuel drums, and vehicles from steel-hulled ships that never seemed to stop coming. Eyewitnesses at Tarawa and later Kwajalein described convoys so massive they resembled floating cities. Prisoners later told interrogators they thought America must have mobilized its entire nation's shipping just for that single battle. In truth, it was only a fraction of the U.S. Navy and Merchant Marine. What stunned Japanese observers most was the specialization of American shipping. Liberty ships carried bulk cargo, attack transports carried troops, LSTs, landing ship tank, carried vehicles and heavy equipment, and oilers refueled fleets at sea. Japan lacked such variety. Most imperial supply runs depended on overburdened destroyers or requisitioned freighters. American convoys looked like organized machines, every vessel serving a precise function. Japanese soldiers also confronted the concept of floating replacement depots. U.S. service squadrons established advanced bases at anchorages like Ulithi and Eniwetok, where repair ships, hospital ships, and supply vessels clustered together. An entire American fleet could rearm, refuel, and set sail again without returning to Pearl Harbor. For Japanese defenders, seeing damaged warships return to action within weeks was a psychological blow. Many assumed these were new ships entirely, not realizing they had been repaired and resupplied afloat. The speed of construction was another revelation. Post-war interrogations recorded disbelief when Japanese officers learned that American shipyards produced more than 2,700 Liberty ships during the war, alongside tankers, destroyers, and carriers. By 1944, U.S. shipyards were launching more tonnage every 6 months than Japan had built in the entire war. Japanese soldiers, who often fought without resupply for months, could hardly conceive of such industrial output. Convoys also carried luxuries that drove the point home. Japanese prisoners were called seeing American soldiers drink fresh milk, eat ice cream, and hand out candy bars, items shipped thousands of miles in refrigerated holds. For men who had subsisted on moldy rice and rainwater, the fact that the enemy could spare cargo space for treats proved industrial superiority beyond doubt. By the time Americans invaded the Marianas, Japanese soldiers watching from bunkers saw not just ships, but abundance incarnate. Row after row of transports unloading tanks, trucks, and artillery, followed by floating cranes and pontoon barges. The sea itself seemed to carry America's factories directly to the battlefield. When interrogated after the war, a former Japanese officer summed it up. "Our empire could not build enough ships to feed its soldiers. Your country built so many that you fed your soldiers ice cream."
That single contrast revealed why Japan's armies slowly withered while America's grew stronger with each passing month. For Japanese soldiers, the ground war revealed America's capacity to move men and supplies, but it was in the sky that industrial might became most terrifying. By 1944, the Pacific Islands were within reach of vast bomber fleets. The sheer number of aircraft, assembled, fueled, and launched day after day, was unlike anything the Japanese military had prepared for. On the home front, air raid-alongs became a grim routine. Cities that had once seemed untouchable now faced swarms of American bombers. The B-24 Liberator, nicknamed the Flying Boxcar, arrived first in large numbers. Its long range allowed attacks on Rabaul, Truk, and later the Philippines. But it was the arrival of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress that marked the true beginning of Japan's nightmare. Stationed in the Marianas after the summer of 1944, B-29s represented a new scale of warfare. Japanese observers on the ground wrote of skies filled with silver dragons, endless streams of bombers glinting in the sun. One soldier described watching wave after wave. We counted hundreds, then stopped. They blotted out the light itself. For defenders, the psychological blow was devastating. The Japanese Air Force had been designed to fight numerically limited enemies, small British or Dutch detachments, or isolated American units in the Philippines. Against hundreds of heavy bombers, escorted by equally numerous fighters, resistance seemed impossible. Even when interceptors managed to climb into position, they often faced tight bomber formations bristling with .50 caliber machine guns. Losses mounted quickly. Ground soldiers felt the effect directly. At Iwo Jima, pre-invasion bombardment brought bombers in endless relays. From February 1945, American bombers flew more than 8,000 sorties against the island before Marines even landed. Japanese diaries called it the thunder that never ends. Men lived in caves, choking on dust, unable to sleep, convinced that American industry had given the enemy a limitless sky. What most shocked Japanese prisoners later was the replacement rate. When a B-29 went down, another appeared within days. Damaged planes limped back, repaired at depots in Guam or Saipan, and returned almost immediately. This was only possible because U.S. factories produced B-29s at a rate unthinkable in Japan. Boeing, Bell, and Martin turned out nearly 4,000 superfortresses in less than 3 years. Contrast was stark. Japanese aircraft production peaked in 1944, but most were light fighters, fragile and lightly armed. By 1945, the empire struggled to fuel even these limited numbers. Meanwhile, American bombers flew missions with an abundance of fuel, spare engines, and trained crews. Soldiers noted that U.S. pilots rotated out regularly for rest, while Japanese flyers often flew until death. The system itself reflected industrial power. Machines and men could be replaced because the nation behind them never ran dry.
The psychological strain grew unbearable as bombing raids extended to the Japanese homeland. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, cities reduced to smoking ruins. For soldiers returning from the front, the sight was crushing. They realized that while they had bled for scraps of coral and jungle, America had built a fleet of bombers capable of destroying their nation's heartland at will. Post-war interrogations captured the disbelief. A former Japanese officer admitted, "We thought perhaps 100 bombers was the maximum effort. Then we saw 1,000 over Tokyo. We understood then that we could not win." For the infantryman in a cave on Saipan or Okinawa, or the civilian crouched in a Tokyo air raid shelter, American bombers embodied a single truth. Industry had become a weapon greater than any samurai spirit or tactical skill. The sky itself had been conquered, not by divine winds, but by factories that never stopped. By 1945, Japanese soldiers no longer spoke of American power in abstract terms. They saw it in every rifle, every jeep, every airplane, and every shell fired against them. What struck them most was not simply the number of American weapons, but the variety.
To men trained in an army that often fought with outdated rifles and improvised equipment, the Americans seemed to possess an endless catalog of machines for every conceivable task. On Saipan, captured Japanese officers were astonished at the Americans' mechanization. Trucks hauled water, bulldozers cleared rubble, cranes unloaded ships, and amphibious tractors crawled from surf to sand without pause. "Even their shovels are machines," one officer remarked bitterly in interrogation. Where Japanese soldiers dug trenches with picks and bare hands, American engineers arrived with caterpillar bulldozers, carving entire networks of roads and airfields in days. Small arms reinforced the point. American infantry carried the semi-automatic M1 Garand, a rifle that could fire twice as fast as the Japanese Arasaka. Each squad also fielded automatic weapons, the Browning automatic rifle, the Thompson submachine gun, backed by platoon-level machine guns and mortars. Japanese soldiers, trained to make every bullet count, were stunned by the volume of fire U.S. troops could produce. One Japanese diary from Leyte records, "They shoot as if bullets grow on trees." Artillery added to the shock. The United States fielded 105mm and 155mm howitzers in enormous numbers, with unlimited shells delivered daily. Japanese defenders, accustomed to rationing rounds carefully, found themselves subjected to barrages that lasted hours. Survivors later testified that the constant explosions convinced them America had more guns than Japan had men. Tanks further demonstrated the industrial divide. Japanese garrisons rarely saw more than a handful of Type 95 light tanks, already obsolete by the mid-war years. Against them rolled Sherman after Sherman, standardized, reliable, and produced by the tens of thousands. A Japanese officer captured on Luzon admitted, "We believed each enemy tank destroyed was a victory. Then we learned your factories built more each month than we destroyed in a year."
Even logistics vehicles spoke of abundance. Jeeps zipped through jungles, bridging the gap between infantry and command. Trucks carried entire battalions in hours where Japanese troops marched for days. Supply chains did not depend on horse carts, as in the Imperial Army, but on gasoline-fed fleets that seemed inexhaustible. Perhaps the most telling image was the CB airfield. Marines would seize a strip of beach, and within days, Navy construction battalions laid pierced steel planking, erected fuel dumps, and had P-51 Mustangs or B-25 Mitchells taking off from fresh runways. Japanese soldiers, watching this unfold, often believed Americans had prepared these airfields in advance. In truth, it was the speed and mechanization of American engineering that made it possible. Post-war records confirm the scale. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 324,000 aircraft, 2.4 million trucks, 6.5 million rifles and carbines, billions of rounds of ammunition. These numbers defied imagination. Japan's entire wartime aircraft production, about 76,000 planes, was less than what the United States built in a single year at its peak. For the Japanese soldier, such figures were not statistics, but lived experience. Every day on the front lines, they confronted machines without end. As one Japanese veteran reflected in 1946, "We thought spirit could overcome material. But the enemy had both spirit and material. He had machines for every soldier and soldiers for every machine. That was the true weapon." By the war's final year, the myth of Japanese invincibility had been crushed by a factory-driven war machine that simply refused to run dry. For men who had fought on meager rations with worn-out weapons, America's arsenal of democracy was not an abstract slogan. It was a battlefield reality, loud, metallic, and endless.